in John chapter 6, John tells us the story of Jesus walking on water. And this picture of Jesus walking on water, just like it's this solid floor, not sinking under, not swimming really high, but walking on water, is a controversial thing. Of course, many people who don't believe Jesus is God say that could have never happened. It must have been a vision or a mirage, or he was close to the shore and following around. But we believe that this was actually a demonstration of Jesus as God, as showing it was not necessary for him to live within the creation as people had come to know at that time. At that time, I don't remember any story in the Bible or in any myth or any tradition or anything that ever said, here's this guy, says he's God, and he can walk right on top of water. And I say that in contrast to last week. We talked about him multiplying the loaves and the fishes. Well, we do have something similar to that in the manna in the wilderness. We do have a story of the prophet Elijah multiplying loaves to feed 100 people. So we have similar things, but there's nothing else like this. In John chapter 6, starting in verse 16, it says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. That's all John says about that part. But this story is also in Mark, which Mark was the person who was writing the story for Peter. And the story is also in Matthew. And we believe the reason that John focused on the miracle, on the proof of Jesus as God, is because everybody else had read the other Gospels and knew those details. But just to refresh our mind, I'd like to read from Matthew 14 and verse 22. Matthew says it like this. Immediately he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. That's very important information. We often see the disciples as kind of Jesus' gatekeepers. They tried to keep the people from pressing in too close or demanding too much. They sort of protected him and traveled with him. And it seems really weird that he would say, get in the boat and go across the lake without me. I'm staying here. Go on, go. But that's what both the book of Matthew and Mark say. And I think it's important for us to kind of grapple with that. I think we see him as being protected by the disciples, but really he was the protector. He was sending them out across the Sea of Galilee, about 7 miles across, knowing full well they were going to run into some trouble. And he went back into the mountain to pray. There were a couple of mountains that surround the Sea of Galilee. And it's the reason, even though they call it a sea, it's really a lake, compared to our Great Lakes, not that great. It's about 7 miles across and much more a lake than a sea, but in its ability to kind of whoop up a storm, it was amazing because it was low and not very high above sea level, and the mountains were there, and so a wind coming through those mountains could really whip up a storm. But we also believe that this and another storm that we hear about when Jesus was sleeping in the boat, we believe that there was a supernatural character to that storm because the disciples, most of them, were experienced fishermen, experienced with the Sea of Galilee, knew how to handle it, knew how to read the signs in the sky, knew how to manage their boat in a storm. And both of those times, they were overwhelmed and terrified and thinking they were going to lose their lives. So John continues, it was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So apparently, they were going across thinking Jesus was going to walk around, and when they saw where he was, they were going to row over to there add him to the party, but it's dark and no sign of Jesus. And when Jesus is absent, and they were not expecting him to be absent, they would naturally get concerned. And the darkness, again, there's a spiritual element to it. It's not just that it's getting dark, it's feeling dark. Like, where is Jesus? And the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, so they're struggling, rowing against this storm, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. And coming near the boat, and they were very frightened. Now it says they saw Jesus. It doesn't say they saw a man-like figure. It says they saw Jesus, but apparently they didn't recognize him, or they weren't looking for him to be walking on water. Again, we already pointed out there's never been a miracle like this before. But they were frightened. And he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Now that's something that you wouldn't think Jesus would really need to say to them, but he did. He calmed them. And again, we're going to just pop over to Matthew chapter 14, verse 28. He gives us some more detail. He says, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Peter's testing Jesus. He's not sure. He's thinking that's Jesus. And he's saying, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Now that's an amazing thing. Peter had that in his personality, to be impulsive and to commit to things that he thought were good, that God was asking him to do, and really probably some other things before he came to follow Jesus. That's his nature. But he had faith. He was doing the same kind of miracle that Jesus was doing. Jesus was the power behind Peter's walking. But when Peter saw the wind, so think about it, it's not like he's walking on this smooth floor. The waves are crashing and carrying on, and the wind is blowing. And so when he sort of thinks, what am I doing? This is a storm. When he saw the wind, he was afraid and was beginning to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Now, I haven't, so I'm going to assume you haven't, ever been in this kind of situation. You might have been out in a boat, in a lake, in a storm. Might have. You might have been afraid the boat was going to fill with water, and you might have been afraid the waves were going to come across and that you were going to drown, but you weren't walking on the water. I can't really imagine what that felt like, to first have the confidence of, I'm doing this too, to feeling like I'm going down. I don't know if Peter was much of a swimmer, but it was a storm, and he was frightened and cried out, "Lord, save me." Now, this story is not in the Bible by accident. We don't have 3 Gospels telling us this story by accident. And the lesson is not, go and do likewise. You should be able to walk on water too. That is not the point Jesus is making. The point he's making is that we are going to face storms. And just as you heard me begging God to stop about 20 storms as we were praying earlier, that tends to be our response. God, take away the storm. Fix it for me. Make this situation right. We prayed for Eleanor. She's in a storm. It's a spiritual storm. It's not a wind-blowing storm, but she's feeling spiritual forces of darkness come against her, and she's asking other Christians who don't even know her or understand her ministry, please pray for me, support me, because I'm sinking. God, save me. This feels terrible. And I pick on her, but I believe that everyone sitting in this room, everyone hearing my voice, if you're not in a storm right now, you're in a coma, because we're in a storm.
Yes,
We are in a storm that is unlike anything we've really experienced before. Our very foundations are being rattled. There's not a safe place you could run away to and hide from all the things that are coming against us. We're in a storm. And I often pray, God, take away the storm. Kill the virus. Stop it. We've had enough. Can't take this anymore. And then I think, but what if this is really a storm you're using? Like, what if we are really backslidden and we don't know it? What if we're really in a little mess and we don't even know it? And if that's the case, God, and you're using the storm like you did with Peter to show him, keep our eyes on you, then I have to change my prayer and backtrack and say, okay, help us, God, in the storm, because it's really bad. We all have little private things about it. People that we know who are vulnerable, situations that we're pushed to be in or that we want to be in that we're being told to stay out of that are near and dear to us. We just experienced a Thanksgiving where we're bad people if we get together with our family and give thanks. We're being told all the things that are normally what give us strength and foundation that we draw on. They're being just kicked right out, just like Peter's legs going down in the water and thinking, God, I thought you were helping me do this. And I believe that storms that continue and build and political things happening and local things happening and misunderstanding and anger and people seeing things differently and fighting with each other and saying, you must not really be a good person because you don't see this like I do. All those things are because our battle is not against a physical storm. Our battle is not against the people that we get angry at and see and argue with and unfriend and all that stuff. Our battle is with spiritual powers of darkness. And no one wants to hear that, but that's the truth. It's a spiritual storm. And God sometimes uses spiritual storms to get our attention and to remind us who he is, just as he did here. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I do believe he said that in love. He wanted the very best for Peter. He didn't say that in criticism. He didn't say, you're never going to make it, buddy. He said it in love. He says it to you and me when we step out and feel God saying, I'm calling you to do this, and then we think, oh, this is pretty stormy and scary and awful, and I don't know if I'm up for this. I think I'm going to go home and hide under the covers. And it's a human thing, but it's given to us so that we understand our job is not to doubt. That's why we sang, probably you think, too many songs about our God saves, because he does. He doesn't just save us from hell. He saves us. He redeems us. He draws us to himself. He knows what's best for us, and even when it's an icky pandemic storm, even when it's a political storm, if it's a fight in your family, if you feel sick, if you feel down, if you feel just pushed around and life's not being fair, and how could it feel fair to someone who's graduating from high school or trying to go to college and all the different things that they had built in their hearts and minds they were going to do, and everybody just said, just stay home and be quiet. Don't bother, because we're not going to let you out right now. It is not the message that encourages people. It's a storm. Right. And Jesus did not immediately fix the storm for Peter. Jesus could have protected Peter even when he looked up and doubted and looked at the waves and said, oh my, Jesus could have still kept him up. He didn't have to let him go down. The lesson for Peter, with all the things he was going to face, was to help Peter become the Peter he became, to help Peter become the preacher, to help Peter become the miracle worker, to help Peter become the one that God knew he could be, But without the storm, he would not get there. He can't just make us or Peter like that. We live through experiences, and that's what makes us who God sees us to be. And when they got into the boat, that's Jesus and Peter, the wind ceased. Nice time. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now remember, they just saw him feed 5, 10, 15,000 people with those 5 little loaves and 2 fish, but that didn't make them say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." But this did it. And we see that over and over and over, not just with the disciples, but with Israel, over and over, seeing the mighty hand of God do amazing things. And they say, wow. We see it with foreign kings who are not part of Israel. We see Nebuchadnezzar saying, wow, this is the God. Everyone ought to worship him. But they all backslide. They have it for a moment, and they let it go, just like Peter had it for a moment, steps right out. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you and I will." And then they doubt. And it's the devil's job to make you doubt. It is the devil's job, just as he did Eve in the garden, to say, "Oh, did God really say that? I don't think you really have that right." And when you are called by God to speak to someone, to do something, to offer the cup of cold water, to help at the warming center, whatever it is that God calls you to do, and then you say, I don't really think that was the Holy Spirit, right? You give up your blessing. You give up your ability to mature and go forward with God. And people who just sit in their pew and ruminate become like pickles. They just shrivel and just are well preserved, but kind of worthless. And you don't want to be that. I don't want to be that. In this time that we feel is so short, there's very little time to help our world see who Jesus is. Don't be a pickle in a jar. Get out there into the storm. Do whatever it is that God is calling you to do. John continues in his sort of just very objective version of the story in verse 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land to which they were going. So another miracle here that we often miss because of the whole walking on water thing. They had been out in the storm, struggling, rowing halfway across the lake, but immediately they're where they were going. And I think that many of us do not persevere. I do not persevere. I can't speak for you, but I'll own it. I do not persevere when I begin to sink. I cower and hide and draw back and rationalize and come up with reasons why that can't be God and lose the blessing. Absolutely lose it. And not just the blessing, but lose what God has called me to do. Joshua, in the book that describes his life, what a hard act to follow. He had to follow Moses, who, people say was humble, he was wonderful, he did everything right. People revere him. Now Joshua gets to pick it up, and it had to be a scary thing, even though he had been close to Moses, he had been taught by Moses. Those Israelites were a tough bunch. They were not easy to lead. And God actually spoke to Joshua. Some people think in an audible voice. In chapter 1, it just has God speaking to Joshua. In verse 9, it says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." That's a promise to Joshua, but I believe that's a promise that you can choose to claim today. God, you are with me wherever I go. And we don't know yet where you're going to be called to go. Right now, They're not letting you visit sick people in the hospital or the nursing homes, but at some point you might be. Are you going to cower and worry about, do I have a strong enough mask? Or worry about, is this really the right thing to do? If God asks you to go, I pray that you go. If God asks you to do something that is beyond what feels common sense, test it. It's okay. Peter said, Jesus, if that's you, ask me to come. I'm not saying that you should just be goofy and just off doing all kinds of craziness, but when God calls you and you know that in your heart, stick with it, because it's the devil's job to undermine that and to bring the eyes to the storm, not to the Savior. And this is such an amazing story that it's very easy to think, well, God hasn't asked me to do anything that amazing. God asks us to do things right where we are. And if you feel like God is not talking to you, not asking you anything, you are not listening, because God's talking. He says in Matthew 28, verse 20, I am with you always to the end of the age. And we can know for sure that God is not going to leave us, not going to forsake us, not going to let us drown. He will reach out when we say, Lord, help. Our God saves. And he's saying to the church today, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because fear is the thing that I see as the most powerful thing in this pandemic. I see, as a nurse in the ER, more trouble with anxiety and fear than I see with true COVID. I see people who get a positive test and they consider it a death sentence. And they just say, help me, I'm going to die. They're not going to die. A few people are dying, but many, many more people are becoming quivering puddles of jelly, unable to do anything but just cry and shudder. And our God says, don't be afraid. Amen. Don't let that be you. That's a powerful thing. Be strong. Be courageous. Whatever storm God allows in your life, in my life, in our nation, in our world, He is more than able to take you through that and see you through that. More than able. The only thing that will limit you is if you let the devil say, did God really talk to you? And we know that He does. But sometimes we don't listen. And my prayer for you today, for all of us today, for myself first of all, is God, make us brave. Help us not to be afraid. Help us to listen to your voice that is saying, do not be afraid.